So in this video, I'm going to introduce you to a German professor who's here at the United States at Oregon State University. His name is Dr. Philip Kneis. And I talked about, I didn't understand what was going on. Like, why is Chancellor Scholz delivering these, or not willing to deliver Taurus missiles, given, his background and whatever. And he reached out to me and we got into a conversation. I said, hey, we got to do an episode about this. We'll talk about this. We'll also talk about the leaked German conversation, and we'll get into both of those conversations here in just a moment. But Philip, please introduce yourself, like what you do at Oregon State and some of your background.
Yes, I'm Phil Kneis. I teach political science, mostly political theory at Oregon State University. I'm originally a cultural and political theorist, so I look at the longer picture of things. I also teach classes in peace studies for Tübingen University, and so this is kind of an area that interests me. I'm also from East Germany originally, so I grew up under the Soviets, and I have some ideas of what drives Russia and Russians. And so the issue of Ukraine and the war of Russia by Ukraine has been very, very much part of my life.
And so, being of about a similar age, I would imagine, I remember when the wall fell, and I remember being in high school, and the Russians were the bad guys, and so I get, the way that most of the people that watch my YouTube videos are my age or above, and usually in the 65 plus club. Like they're usually about 10 years or more older than I'm 50. So, but these people understand, they remember the former Soviet Union in a meaningful way, where I think the younger generation just doesn't get the threat that is still pervasive in the ideology. So help us unpack some of that, and then we'll get into the question of, like, what was Scholz doing?
Well, the threat is there, and we can see the Soviet Union as a socialist or communist or whatever you want to call that empire. I mean, it's called Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, because socialism is what's here in reality. Communism is that what you hope for the future. But you can also see it as an extension of the old Russian Empire. And that perspective shows you that whatever political system you have, whatever government you have, there are longer patterns in foreign policy. That sounds familiar also for US foreign policy. And that the interests of countries oftentimes survive different systems. So if you understand how the Soviet Union was just one aspect of Russian imperialism, even though it claimed not to be imperialist, the events going on right now are not that surprising. And so it also explains how every single country that was occupied by the Soviets had nothing better to do than to wait to get into NATO, and ideally into the European Union, because the threat has always been there.
That's right.
And there's this historical pattern that is very disturbing, that on one side of these countries were the Russians, on the other side, the Germans and Austrians. And everything in between, whatever it was called, Germany, Prussia, Austria, Hungary, and Russia, everything in between was negotiable.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And people tend to forget that World War II began by an alliance of Hitler and Stalin.
Right.
The two of them were allied, and Germany attacked first. I don't believe what Tucker Carlson got out of Putin. And a few days later, Russia attacked, or the Soviet Union attacked from the other side.
So as I heard you talking, I was thinking, well, the French with Napoleon did the same thing. So it's broader than that. It's also the West, but there's also probably a lot more history, if you go back far enough, of these two groups writ large being at each other as well. And certainly, Lithuanian, Poland, and Turkey, and all the other groups in the neighborhood. But so with the history, going back with a historical eye on what's happened, so help us with your Eastern Europe, East Germany kind of mentality, bring that to bear on what's going on, and then what's going on with Scholz.
So this history explains a little bit how German and Russian perspectives have been close. To many Germans, it's important to take Russia's security considerations into view. So even though World War II started with this alliance, eventually Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. Before that, as you mentioned, Napoleon did. And Russia has had a history of being attacked from two sides, from the West and then from the Mongol, whatever side. And so there has been this very unhealthy occupation on the German side of trying to think also about Russia's security interests. You see this said a lot.
Mhm.
And that is said also because of a genuine fear of another war where Russians could conquer Germany. So I grew up still with markings at my parents' house that marked um, the air shelter in our basement.
Mhm.
When my now wife visited us the first time, she was amazed at the amounts of food stored in the basement. My father used to joke, well, it's when the Russians come again, so for the next war. I mean, of course, jokingly, but there is a clear fear that if you poke the Russian bear too much,
Mhm.
it's not going to go well. Combined with German guilt over then the attack against the Soviet Union. And I'm not, I mean, you can have, you should have all these thoughts in mind that you say, Soviet Union was a bad system. They occupied after the war, but before that, they eliminated the Nazis with American help, by the way. And you should be able to have all these thoughts in your head and distinguish between what Putin is doing now,
Mhm.
what was done against the Nazis, what Stalin is. But I think people's heads are filled with this muddle where they try to say no more war, because
Mhm.
war in Germany was, of course, devastating. They don't understand Ukraine being really a separate culture and separate country.
Mhm.
Well, of course, it was colonized by Russia for a long time,
Mhm.
by the Russian Federation within the Soviet Union. And the other uncomfortable part is German and Russian business interests that have been aligned in the last decades.
Yeah, and
So especially,
I think there's a lot to that with
yeah,
the German business interests, and I wonder how
mm,
much of that is driving it. But let me go back to something else you said
yeah,
earlier. So you were talking about NATO. Uh, Putin talks about NATO keeps encroaching to the east. They keep moving to the east. No, they're not moving to the east. They're running from the east, and that's why they have gotten under the shelter. And it was Germany and France that were the ones in 2008, if I'm not mistaking it, that objected to, letting Ukraine into NATO. Is that part of the same thing that you were just talking about, or is it there something else motivating that?
well, I mean, the fear of provoking Russia, but we also can't forget that Ukraine was a different country then.
Hmm. Okay, that's fair.
And all the criticism about Ukraine, of being corrupt, of not being quite democratic, well, you just need to watch Zelensky's television show,
Yeah,
Sluga Narodu, in which he talks about all these things.
yeah. They
And
went through like 3 or 4 episodes where they couldn't find a not corrupt judge,
yeah,
right?
and
I mean,
so
so.
the reason why he is so paranoid and tries to keep government close to him is because there is still this layer of old Soviet corruption. And so in 2008, Ukraine wasn't quite ready. So that is out of the question.
Mhm.
We see what's going on in Turkey as a NATO member,
Mhm.
as a huge country within NATO with a government that is borderline democratic. So had Ukraine been admitted, then it would have had to require democratic stability because that's one of the requirements of NATO. Now, NATO is not just a defense union, but it's also a vehicle to promote democracy.
Hmm.
And all the NATO armies are aligned. I mean, I served in the German Bundeswehr, and so I served under NATO rules. And it's a completely different model than the Russian military.
Sure.
I mean, I was taught that yes, I have to follow orders, but only legal orders. And it's my responsibility if I follow an illegal order, and I can't have the excuse of, well, I was just following orders. And that is a lesson that we learned because of World War II.
Yeah.
And all of these shifts in consciousness, shifts in governance, are things that in Ukraine in 2008 were probably not there yet. They're definitely not there in Russia. But what we the discussion about admitting Ukraine into NATO in 2008 would have meant that Ukraine would have been given a path to join NATO within 10 to 15 years.
Hmm.
It would never have meant immediate acceptance into NATO.
Right.
And
And
so,
since
yeah,
2014, it couldn't have because of
yeah,
the incursion over the border. So
yeah.
the 2022 argument, well, we're just preventing you from joining. That's come on, right? Okay, let's move up to now. You are inside of Scholz's head. Like, what's he thinking when he's deciding, no, we're not sending the tourists?
Nobody knows, but there are some suspicions.
Okay.
So he keeps making arguments that aren't borne out by the facts. He says he doesn't want these missiles to reach Moscow or the Kremlin or somewhere else. He says that he doesn't want German troops to have to be there and program the rockets. He says that he doesn't want to really escalate in a way that Germany becomes um, part of the war, as he says, Kriegspartei, party to war. None of these are really true. It is completely legitimate to help Ukraine. For the US and the UK is actually mandated because of the Budapest memorandum. Yeah, the US and UK agreed to help.
Well, so they're mandated in ethics, they're mandated in morality, but I read the Budapest Memorandum and there's nothing actually creating a clear legal stipulation. It's just we're there for you, but didn't
Hmm.
say how. Like it's awkward. Morally, we are.
Hmm.
Um, by the letter of the law, I don't think that we are, but it's morally certainly.
Yeah, but morally means soft power, and the United States is only powerful because of its soft power in the end.
Hmm.
And that's what some people don't seem to understand. But back to Scholz's arguments, none of these make really sense, but people are suspecting that he is being somehow threatened by Putin, or
Hmm.
Germany is being threatened by Putin, or that he is just falling within the trap of Putin doing all his propaganda games to cause sedition.
Hmm.
The first rule in the military is to disguise and dissent. Yeah, so that to make sure that the enemy doesn't even think of attacking you. And so that is partially going on. And then Olaf Scholz was part of the Merkel government, and during that government, they pushed through the Nord Stream pipelines, which even then were recognized as being a tool for war. And even in the state of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, one of the northern East German states, Russian Environmental Foundation was involved in giving the government money to build the Nord Stream pipelines. And there are these business interests. You see the same game being played by Volkswagen and Xinjiang in China. And Volkswagen is owned partially by the state of Lower Saxony, which is one of the SPD's strongholds.
Hmm.
So when we think of American politics being so horribly intertwined with business interests, that's going on everywhere else.
Yeah, I was just about to make the leap to Mike Johnson and that kind of thing, and
Yeah.
apparently they've got their own iteration of that.
So the other problem is that former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who was instrumental in keeping Germany kind of out of the Iraq war, was on the board of Rosneft till he stepped down in 2022 after public pressure.
Hmm.
So there are these ties. There's also a financial scandal that Scholz is involved in the city of Hamburg that he has been able to dodge because it's just so darn complicated and no one understands it. The name of that scandal is something I can't say publicly because it's spelled in just an awkward way. It was And there are some people who think there is compromise or that Putin has been really effective in playing on German war guilt and German warfare.
Yeah.
So, but there's also the suspicion, see, those rockets probably can't be fired from surface to air. They're probably air to surface, as far as I understand.
Hmm.
There may be a technical reason that we don't want to reveal,
Hmm.
which means that maybe once F-16s are delivered, the conversation changes.
No, we hope so. Because
There's all,
like that air superiority from Russia is what's allowing the glide bombs to be able to do the damage that they're
yeah,
doing, replacing the rockets with glide bombs now, which is also why they're getting shot down. But yeah,
there's also, and now this is complete maybe speculation. I think everybody is waiting too that Russian economy, which is now basically transitioning to a war economy, is eventually destabilizing Russia enough that this military response is not as necessary anymore as it is. I mean, we need to remember in World War One, Germany conquered huge parts of France, Belgium, and it lost all of these territories after the war was ended. So
hmm.
no matter how much Russia is conquering right now, that doesn't mean that they'll keep it. And so by putting pressure on it, by avoiding to agitate Russia further, like destroying this bridge with German weapons, by avoiding this, what from a German perspective is seen as escalation, maybe we are stalling long enough for the conflict to solve itself. That may be a speculation.
So he's trying to play a long game, is what you're
Long
saying.
game.
Okay.
The other problem is, again, domestic politics. In East Germany, the Social Democrats, so the moderate left, which is oftentimes wrongly called socialist, but that's the American terminology. The Democrats should stop using that term because it annoys people who know what was called socialist back then. But the Social Democratic Party was destroyed by being forced to unify with the Communist Party. And so the political game that the SPD has in East Germany is very weak. They haven't really been able to rebuild. And the new right-wing extremist Alternative for Germany is getting inroads, and the polls for the SPD are going down.
Right.
By catering to East Germans who have this weird Stockholm syndrome-like
Yeah.
relationship to Russia, he's probably hoping to fight against the Alternative for Germany, and he can only do so by playing on this peace narrative.
Yeah. Okay. So to expand on that last point. So what I found is that East Germans tend to be more cozy with Russia even after being oppressed for however long by the Soviet Union, they still, you'd think that they'd be the ones that like, you know what? Because most of the rest of the world, like if you come from Romania or somewhere else, they're like, nope, I don't want any part of that. You come from Poland, nope, I don't want the Baltic states, nope. But if you're from East Germany, you're like, oh yeah, Russia, we have these warm fuzzies toward them. I'm like, how did that, what's going on?
Well, I mean, you have to distinguish. Some were in the Socialist Unity Party, and so they sided with the system. So they have a very fond memory of Russia. Those who did not have an alternative reality through church or connections to the West were forced into this propaganda narrative.
Hmm.
The other thing is something you could say, well, we know the enemy. So there is also fear. So it's a mixture of being used to them, having been acculturated within the Russian world, but
Hmm.
also knowing what we could expect from Russia if Russia attacks.
Okay.
And it is a combination of fear and acculturation. I don't know whether it's necessarily admiration.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing. It seems almost like admiration, but maybe that's not it at all. Maybe I'm because like it seems like a weird thing to admire after having been like you called it Stockholm syndrome earlier, right? That seems more like it. Okay.
Mhm.
So let's switch gears. Let's talk about the leak. They
Mhm.
were apparently in a WebEx meeting talking about this, and somehow it leaked out like the Russians dialed in or something and got it. Tell me what you know here, or what how they were thinking as they were discussing, and more than that.
Germany has been very late to wake up to the electronic game and to the internet. And Chancellor Merkel has been frequently made fun of because she said the internet is like the new country, Neuland. And that was when most people already were online. The Bundeswehr is underfunded. And, everybody wanted Germany to have a weak military for obvious reasons. And Germans now say, well, you wanted us to have a weak military.
Mhm.
And same with the infrastructure. These mistakes may happen, but it's also not that difficult, apparently, to spy on people. Yeah, so there is apparently a large Russian intelligence network still in play. We also know that Merkel's phone was tapped by the Americans earlier, which annoyed quite a lot of Germans.
Sure.
And this technology simply is not always safe. And I think the leak is overblown by Russia because there's nothing in there that is surprising. Of course, we are talking about these missiles. Of course, the missiles would be used to destroy that bridge,
Hmm.
and there's nothing in there. Nothing legally makes Germany a party to war if we give Ukraine these weapons for self defense. But it's playing into the Russian narrative that see the
Yep.
Ukrainians are Nazis because they're supported by Germany. And then
Yeah.
the Germans say, oh, how could we? No, no, we don't want to be done in the back because we did the evil thing back then. And so it's a psychological warfare, nothing else. So I think the real reaction would be like, so what?
Yeah, and there was no conclusion like, yeah, let's go get them. I mean, it was kind of lame, but the Russians have twisted and distorted it into, like you said, that this is the connection. See, and you see that this is connected to that, connected to that. See, everything we said was
Mhm.
true all along. That's how they are. They're
Yeah.
all after us.
And smarter people than Tucker Carlson have fallen for this. I mean, Tucker Carlson has been damned for his interview, but I remember a 4 hour Oliver Stone documentary.
Hmm.
I remember what Noam Chomsky is saying, what
Hmm.
other people are saying, the lie that NATO promised to never expand. All of this is much more complicated. So Russian propaganda simply is that good, sadly.
Yeah.
And we need to just inform people that no, this is a deliberate campaign for sedition.
Okay.
We should keep with that.
So as you were talking, I was formulating a last question. I I read early in the war that there was a split between the punish Russia faction and the we just want peace faction. What's stronger in Germany, and what do you see happening with that? Because there's two ways that people generally see it, and I understand in different countries in Europe it's different.
It depends on where in Germany. The
Oh, that's
Punish
good.
Russia faction is bigger in West Germany than in East Germany.
Hmm.
And in East Germany, the Just Have Peace faction is stronger, which is why Scholz, probably in trying to save his party, wants to cater to East Germans. So there's this domestic interest. However, even within the peace faction, I would not necessarily assume that these are all people who love Putin. These are not necessarily people who are against Ukraine. It's just that fear and historical responsibility outweigh, at least from what people say, the desire to punish Putin.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so we understand post-World War II, and nobody would even faulted Germany if they were just like, look, we're going to help. All we're giving is humanitarian aid. We're just going to be the humanitarian aid leaders of the free world in making sure that they have all the gauze and ambulances and whatever else that they. Nobody would have faulted them for that. So to their credit, they actually did give tanks, waiting for the U.S. to do it, but did give tanks and did give lots of other things. So it's not fair to just say, well, they're not giving tourists. They're just no, they're this. but the Taurus not giving the Taurus or Biden not giving F-16s at the point or whatever it was, it's all Putin deterring the West. It's
Hmm.
bizarre to watch, but Putin has masterfully deterred the West. Talk to that point, and then we'll
Yeah.
wrap up.
Well, you see that at another point. I mean, we shouldn't be talking about Taurus because the real problem is ammunition.
Mhm,
The EU promised a huge amount of ammunition and they under-delivered.
mhm,
So the Taurus debate is also useful for European leaders to say, oh, we're talking about this, whereas we should really talk about how we underperformed on that front.
right.
Also, Austria and Hungary are still dependent on Russian oil and gas. So
Mm,
that explains politics. And inflation hit Germany high with energy prices initially because Putin stopped delivering oil and gas. Then those pipelines were blown up, but that happened after Putin delivered it. So
mm,
Russia is right now avoiding having to pay penalties. They stopped delivering. But all of this has played into life got more expensive. We are afraid. What shall we do? Let's end this. Russians and Ukrainians are dying. What can we do? It's
yeah.
not dissimilar from the US.
Yeah, no, it seems like it's crazy parallel. Okay, what's the last thought that you want to leave with viewers? You teach at Oregon State, so I'm speaking to a mostly American audience, then some Canadian, British, and other Western Europe, maybe some Australian, generally speaking. Last thought.
We are already in a kind of war with Putin. It's not about Ukraine. It's about the West. It's about the global world order. And we need to just stay with it. And we are not defending Ukraine. We are defending ourselves. And I know you always thank everybody for supporting Ukraine. Thank you for always speaking out in favor of Ukraine. And I really appreciate what you do every day in cutting through the nonsense and promoting that we need to do what we need to do in order to help Ukraine because we are
Yeah.
helping. It's a selfish exercise in the end, too. And we need to realize that sometimes people need to be reminded that their self interest is at play here.
Yeah, thanks for that. I figure I'm doing this little bit apart with what tools I can bring to bear. And if these guys can do what they're doing on the ground in Ukraine, certainly I can be in my nice warm home with my 3 meals a day in my own bed and still continue to do this. Much of a headache as it is sometimes, it's still, I mean, it's minuscule in comparison, but it's my way of being able to help.
Yeah.
So all right. Well, thank you, Dr. Nice. I really do appreciate you reaching out and being able to help us understand what's going on and the German perspective in this. And maybe we'll connect again when there's something else connected to Germany and Ukraine. And I really appreciate you being here.
Just let me know. Thank you.
All right.